The ballroom at Ashmore Park was lit as though it intended to shame the moon. 200 candles in the chandeliers above, and the mirrors along the west wall doubling them, so that wherever Cecily Vane turned, she found light she had not expected, and faces that had not yet decided how to arrange themselves when they noticed her. She stood at the edge of the floor in a gown of white muslin with a pale blue sash, the sash mended once at the back where no one would see, and she held a borrowed fan in both hands, and wished, as she had often wished in the 3 years since her father's death, that she could be the kind of woman who did not feel the quality of a room's attention like a temperature change. The fan had belonged to her cousin Dorothea. It was ivory and painted with a summer garden, and it had arrived that afternoon with a note in Dorothea's hand that read only that it would suit the white gown better than her own. It was the kind of generosity that reminded Cecily of everything Dorothea did not say, which was that Cecily's own fan had 3 broken slats, and that she could not have afforded to replace it before the Ashmore ball, and that Dorothea loved her without requiring her to explain. She opened the fan now, cooled her face with it. The air in the ballroom was warm despite the October night beyond the terrace doors, warm with the press of 200 bodies and the smell of beeswax candles and the particular human effort of making everything look effortless. She had almost not come. She had stood in the small bedroom of her cousin's house in the village that afternoon, with the white gown laid across the bed, and told herself with considerable conviction that there was no purpose to it. She was 23 years old. She had no portion, no prospects that could be named in a solicitor's office, and she had appeared at every notable gathering in this county for 3 years without attracting more than the politely interested attention of gentlemen who subsequently discovered that she had no portion. She was, to the season, a kind and capable woman who had somehow arrived at a ball without a future attached to her. The word most commonly applied to her situation was unfortunate. The word had been applied tonight by Lady Aldwych within the first 10 minutes of Cecily's arrival. Lady Aldwych had the particular talent of aristocratic women who have never been required to be kind. She could say unfortunate with the inflection of a compliment, while meaning something closer to irrelevant. She had said it to Mrs. Pennington near the refreshment table as Cecily passed, not quite low enough. And Mrs. Pennington had made the face people make when they are both embarrassed for someone and grateful not to be that person. Cecily had kept walking. She had reached this edge of the floor and found a small, useful corner near a potted arrangement of autumn branches, and she had stood there for the past quarter hour watching the dancing and reminding herself that she was here for Dorothea's sake, because Dorothea had asked her to come, because Dorothea had pressed the fan into her hands and said it would be a kindness. She did not see him until he was already still. That was always the way with James Alderton, the Earl of Carrow, or so she would understand later, when she had occasion to think back. He arrived at stillness rather than at motion. While the room moved around him, he stopped. And the stopping was what registered. He was standing perhaps 20 feet away, with a glass he was not drinking from. And he was not watching the dancing. He was watching the north wall of the ballroom, or he appeared to be, and the quality of his attention was so precisely directed and so utterly contained that for a moment Cecily thought he was angry. Then she understood that he was not angry. He was simply not performing anything for anyone in the room. She had heard a great deal about the Earl of Carrow. This was his estate. It had been his father's estate before him, and his grandfather's before that. And the house was called Ashmore Park, and the ball was called the Ashmore Autumn Gathering, and it happened every October whether the Earl was in the county or not, because the estate ran on its own momentum regardless of what the Earl wished. He was 35. He had been widowed 4 years ago. He had a daughter, 7 years old, named Frances, whom the household staff spoke of with a careful tenderness that told Cecily everything she needed to know about what Frances's daily life looked like without her mother. He turned his head, not toward Cecily. He turned toward the terrace doors, and the candlelight caught the angle of his jaw, and she saw that he was tired in the particular way that has nothing to do with sleep. She opened her fan a little wider and looked away. She was looking away when she felt the folded paper. It was tucked between the second and third slats of the borrowed fan, so small and so precisely placed that she had not noticed it in the carriage on the way here, or in the quarter hour she had been standing at the edge of the floor. She worked it free with 2 fingers, careful not to draw the eye of anyone nearby, and unfolded it against her palm. The handwriting was not Dorothea's. The handwriting was spare and level, the letters formed with the kind of care that is also a kind of discipline, and it said only, "Leave the hall before midnight." And then, below that, a single letter. Cecily stood very still. She looked at the fan. She looked back at the paper. She looked at the ballroom, the candles, the 200 people who did not know she existed. The Earl of Carrow, who had turned back from the terrace doors and was now speaking with a man she recognized as his steward, Harfield, and who did not look in her direction at all. She folded the paper back into her palm and closed her hand around it, and she felt, for the first time that evening, the specific sensation of being in the center of something she did not yet understand. If you have ever stood in a room full of people and been told by a single piece of paper that you matter to someone you cannot identify, you will know why she stayed. The first hour of the evening passed in a particular kind of suspension. Cecily danced twice, both times with partners she did not know well enough to confide in, and did not wish to confide in regardless. She smiled at the right moments. She said the right things. She helped young Miss Fairweather, Dorothea's neighbor's daughter, retrieve a dropped glove with a speed that spared the girl any embarrassment, and she escorted her back to her mother's side with a quiet word about the quality of the music, and the whole transaction was invisible to everyone except possibly Harfield, who stood near the pillar column on her left, and had the look of a man who notices things. She kept the paper in her closed hand. She was not certain why. There was something about holding it that felt like holding the only proof of a thing she was not yet ready to name. She had spent 3 years being the woman who noticed others without being noticed herself. She had developed a precise skill for it. She could tell you which of the Ashmore guests were unhappy in their marriages, which of the mothers were afraid their daughters would not be placed this season, which of the young gentlemen were performing a confidence they had not yet earned. She could read the room the way a navigator reads a coast. She simply could not translate that skill into anything that changed her own situation, because the machinery of the season did not run on perception. It ran on land and money and family connections, and she had none of the 3. The paper had said, "Leave the hall before midnight." She turned it over in her mind, the way you turn a locked thing over, looking for the place it opens. The C at the bottom. She knew a great many people whose names began with C, including herself. That was not helpful. The handwriting. Spare, level, disciplined, nothing that told her whose hand it was, except that the hand belonged to someone who wrote as they presumably did everything else, without flourish, without performance. She was standing near the drawing-room door, watching the second set form, when she heard Lady Aldwych again. Lady Aldwych was not speaking quietly this time. She was speaking with the particular carrying quality of a woman who has decided that a room's awareness of her opinion is more valuable than that opinion's object's feelings. "Poor child," she said to the woman on her left, who turned out to be Mrs. Harcastle from Fillmore Green. a woman whose own situation was complicated enough that she might have been expected to extend some discretion. She has come every autumn for 3 years, and nothing has come of it. One cannot help but feel that some women simply arrive at these occasions without understanding that there is nothing left to arrive for. Mrs. Hardcastle made a sound of agreement that had no spine in it. Lady Aldwych turned her head, and her gaze swept the room, and it landed for a precise 3 seconds on Cecily before continuing. Cecily counted to 4. Then she moved, not away from Lady Aldwych, but deeper into the room, toward the piano that stood against the east wall, where a young woman was playing a country air with great competence and no joy at all, and she stood near the piano bench and listened, and she let the music settle over her like something useful. The Earl of Carrow was across the room. She was not looking at him. She knew where he was with the particular peripheral awareness she had developed over the past hour. The way you know where a fire is, even when you are not facing it. He was not looking at her either. He was speaking with Lord Hemby, who was something in the government, and who had the look of a man who considers every room a negotiation. The Earl's face was attentive and absolutely composed, and there was nothing about his posture that suggested he had recently placed a note in anyone's fan. The clock above the mantelpiece read 10:15. Midnight was an hour and 3/4 away. She had time. She was not certain what she was going to do with the time, except endure it and think, and the thinking was not resolving into anything clear. The note might have nothing to do with her. The note might have been placed in the fan before Dorothea lent it. Meant for someone else entirely. Some other woman who had borrowed this fan in some previous season and never returned it. The C at the bottom might stand for something besides a name. It might be a marking of some kind, a dressmaker's notation, a household code. She unfolded it again in her palm. Looked at it. Looked at the handwriting again. It was not a notation. It was a warning. She knew the difference between a notation and a warning, because she had received warnings before, from people who meant well and people who did not. And they all had this quality in common. They arrived when someone knew something that you did not, and they arrived quietly, because the thing they were protecting you from was not yet public. Leave the hall before midnight. She folded it again. She put it into the small reticule at her wrist. She went to find Dorothea. Dorothea was in the card room off the main hall. Not playing cards, but sitting with her husband beside a woman Cecily did not recognize, and the conversation had the tone of something that required 2 more people to reach any conclusion. Cecily caught Dorothea's eye from the doorway. Dorothea excused herself with the ease of a woman who has excused herself from card rooms her entire adult life, and came to the door, and Cecily drew her a few steps into the corridor, and kept her voice low. "The fan," she said. "Did you find anything in it when you lent it to me?" Dorothea looked at her with an expression that managed to be both curious and entirely guileless. "I have not opened that fan in 2 years," she said. "It was in the drawing-room cabinet." "Why?" Cecily considered this for a moment. "No reason," she said. Dorothea looked at her for a breath longer than necessary. "You have found something." "I am not certain what I have found." "Cecily." "I think," Cecily said carefully, "that the fan may have been used as a means of communication before. By someone who did not know I would have it tonight. Or by someone who did." She paused. Either possibility is equally unclear. Dorothea glanced down the corridor and then back at her cousin. "Is it alarming?" "No, I do not think so. It is a warning. Someone wishes me to leave before midnight." "Then perhaps," said Dorothea, with the calm of a woman who trusts her instincts about most things. You should decide whether you trust the person who wrote it. Cecily thought about the handwriting. Spare, level, disciplined, no performance. I think, she said slowly, that I do. She went back into the ballroom. The half-hour struck, and then the three-quarter. And the evening thickened around her in the way that evening always does, when you are waiting for something and trying not to look as though you are waiting. She accepted a glass of negus she did not drink. She spoke with Mr. and Mrs. Farthingale about the prospects for the winter season in Bath, which neither of them was actually going to attend. She watched the dancing. The Earl of Carrow danced once, with a woman she recognized as Miss Honoria Aldwych, Lady Aldwich's niece, who was very beautiful and very well positioned, and who moved through the ballroom with the easy authority of someone who has never had reason to doubt her welcome in any room. He danced with her with perfect courtesy and returned her to her aunt's side and did not ask her to dance again. Lady Aldwych watched this. Her fan moved once, a precise little motion that was not cooling, but calculation. Then, at 11:20, the Earl of Carrow crossed the room. He did not cross it toward the dancing, or toward the refreshment table, or toward Lord Hemby, who was still waiting to finish whatever negotiation the government required of him. He crossed it toward the piano, where Cecily had been standing for the past quarter hour, listening to the young woman who now had an expression of some relief at having been permitted to stop playing. He stopped beside her with 6 inches of propriety between them and looked at the piano for a moment. And then he said, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear it, "Miss Vane." She turned. She looked at him directly, because she had long since decided that the women who pretended not to notice the men who spoke to them were working much harder than anyone gave them credit for. "My lord," she said. Up close, the tiredness she had observed from across the room was more specific. It was not the tiredness of a man who had been working too hard, though he had the look of that too. It was the tiredness of a man who had been carrying something for a long time and who had not set it down. "You received the note," he said. She did not make him wait for the answer. "Yes." He looked at her for a moment. Not the way most men looked at her, which was either without interest or with a calculating attention that was essentially about her lack of portion. He looked at her the way she had learned to look at rooms, as though he was trying to understand something accurately, not to catalog it. "Then you know to leave before midnight." "I know the instruction," she said. "I do not yet know the reason." He was quiet for 3 seconds. In the middle of a ballroom full of music and voices, 3 seconds of quiet is a long time. She counted them. "Lord Aldwych intends to make an announcement at midnight," he said. "He has told Harfield that it concerns a private arrangement. He used the phrase, 'a fortunate resolution.'" She felt something go still in her chest. Lord Aldwych. Lady Aldwich's husband, who sat in the House of Lords, and who was, among other things, the trustee of the Vane family's remaining legal interest in the Hartfield property, the small estate her father had left in a state of complicated encumbrance when he died 3 years ago. The property that was technically still in the family's name, though she had not been able to pay the maintenance. The property that a London solicitor had written to her about 6 months ago, with a letter she had read 4 times, and then placed in the drawer she kept locked, because reading it a 5th time had not made its contents less true. "He would not," she said. The words came out with more certainty than she felt. "He would," said the Earl, "and intends to, because he believes you are unaware of the letter his solicitor sent to the Aldwych household in August, and he believes you have no recourse, and he has arranged the announcement for a public occasion because announcements made publicly are more difficult to contest." She breathed. Once, carefully. "How do you know this?" she said. It was not entirely a question. Because Harfield told me, and Harfield knows because he has been managing this estate's correspondence with Aldwick's office for the past 8 years, and because I asked him to tell me when something required my attention. He paused. The Hartfield property borders the Ashmore Eastern Fields. I have known about the encumbrance for some time. And you have known about the encumbrance and said nothing, she said. Until tonight, he said. There was nothing useful to say. She looked at him. He looked at her. The music started again somewhere behind them, a slower air this time, and the room shifted into a new configuration of couples and observers. "Leave before midnight," he said again. "Go to Harfield in the East Corridor. He has a document for you to sign. It will be dated yesterday. It will not be contested." She did not ask immediately what the document contained. She asked the question she needed to ask more than that one. "Why?" she said. He was quiet again. She watched the set of his jaw and the particular quality of his stillness, and she waited, because she had learned that the things people say when they are being honest, rather than performing, tend to arrive in their own time. "Because," he said very quietly, "you helped my daughter in June." She had not expected that. She thought back to June, to the summer gathering at the Pembridge estate. She had been there, briefly, accompanying Dorothea. She had been in the garden before the dinner when she had come across a child sitting alone beside the rose arbor, crying with the concentrated, silent effort of a child who has learned not to make a sound when she cries. She had sat down on the bench beside her without making anything of it, and she had talked to her about the roses and about the color of the sky and about a particularly interesting beetle she had observed on the garden path. And by the time the girl had stopped crying and told her that her name was Frances, she had been sitting there for a quarter of an hour, and the sun had moved past the arbor, and everything was calmer. She had not known who Frances was. She had not known, until much later that evening when she saw the Earl arriving for dinner, that she had been sitting with the Earl of Caro's daughter. She had not thought of it again. "She told me," he said, "about the woman in the garden who talked about beetles." Cecily felt something move in her chest that was not useful at a public occasion. She was distressed, she said. It seemed unkind to walk past. "Yes," he said. He looked at the piano. "She is distressed with some frequency. She has been distressed with some frequency since she was 3 years old, and I made a decision that I believed was protecting her from something, and the decision produced a household in which a child learned not to make sound when she cried." He paused. "You may consider that I am repaying a debt. That is the frame that will make the most sense to most people." "And the accurate frame?" she said, because she had already decided she trusted the handwriting. He turned his head and looked at her with an expression she could not entirely read, except that it contained something that was not performance, and not calculation, and not tiredness, or not only tiredness. "Go find Harfield," he said, "before the clock strikes 11. And Miss Vane." He paused. "Come back after." She went. Harfield was in the East Corridor as the Earl had said, a quiet man of 50 with a sheaf of papers in a leather wallet, and the expression of someone who has been waiting and is relieved to be done with it. He was not alone. There was a man beside him whom Cecily recognized after a moment as Mr. Croft, a solicitor from York, who had the look of a man who had traveled some distance and was prepared to be useful. She read the document. She read it twice. It was a deed of purchase, dated the previous day, for the Hartfield property and its encumbrances, in the amount of £1,200, transferred to her own name, the encumbrances discharged, the maintenance arrears settled, the trustee's authority over the estate formally terminated. She looked at Harfield. "Where did the purchase price come from?" Harfield looked at Mr. Croft. Mr. Croft looked at his papers. "From the Ashmore estate accounts," Harfield said. "My lord directed it this morning." She stood for a moment in the east corridor of Ashmore Park with the document in her hand, and the clock on the landing reading 7 minutes to 11, and the music in the ballroom faintly audible through the walls. "He spent this morning," she said carefully, "arranging the purchase of a property he has not yet discussed with me." "He spent this morning," Harfield said, "with the equanimity of a man who has worked for the same employer for 8 years and has learned to trust the employer's instincts, ensuring that you had something to sign before Lord Aldwych made his announcement. Whether anything further is discussed is not within my remit." She looked at the document again. She thought about the handwriting, spare and level and disciplined. She signed it. She came back into the ballroom at 2 minutes past 11, and she was aware, as she came back, of Lady Aldwych watching her entrance from the chair near the fireplace, where she had been sitting for the past hour, like a general at a campaign. Lady Aldwich's fan moved again, that small, precise motion. The Earl of Carrow was standing near the windows. He saw her cross the room. He did not move toward her, and she did not move toward him, because they were in a ballroom with 200 people in it, and they had been acquainted, publicly, for approximately 40 minutes, and anything more than proximity would produce a conversation that neither of them had yet had. But she looked at him, and he looked at her. And in the small charged space of that mutual recognition, something was settled between them that had no public name yet, and did not require one. At 5 minutes past midnight, Lord Aldwych rose from his seat near the card-room door and moved to the center of the ballroom with the deliberate authority of a man who has rehearsed an occasion. He cleared his throat. The music stopped. The room turned. He spoke. He said that he was pleased to announce a resolution to a matter that had been pending for some months, concerning the estate formerly known as Hartfield, which had been held in trust during the period of its encumbrance, and that he was happy to announce that the matter had been concluded to everyone's satisfaction. He said this in the tone of a man reading from a prepared text that had become briefly inaccurate. Lady Aldwich's fan stopped moving entirely. Lord Aldwych continued. He said that the estate had been settled. He said that the outstanding question of its disposition had been resolved by private arrangement. He said that he wished to acknowledge the parties involved. He looked across the room, us. He found the Earl of Carrow. He found, after a moment, Cecily. She watched Lord Aldwych understand, in real time, that the announcement he had prepared was no longer the announcement he was able to make. She watched him reconstruct the sentence on the spot, as people who are accustomed to public occasions sometimes can, so that the truth came out in language that did not reveal how different it was from what he had intended. "Miss Vane," he said, "retains full title to the Hartfield estate as of yesterday's date." The room was very quiet. Then Mrs. Farthingale said something to her husband in a low voice, and her husband said something back, and the murmur of a room that has witnessed something it is still processing ran through the gathered company like a current. Lady Aldwych rose from her chair. She looked at the Earl of Carrow. She looked at Cecily. Something moved across her face that was, Cecily thought, the expression of a woman encountering the edge of a map she had believed had no edges. She did not say anything to Cecily. She said something to her husband in a tone so low it did not carry, and Lord Aldwych made a face that suggested the conversation would continue at some length later. And then she turned back to the room with a composure that was, whatever else one might say about her, genuine. The music resumed. The room began to move again. The Earl crossed the floor. He crossed it in 3 strides, or perhaps 4, and he stopped beside her at the proper social distance. And he did not do anything that would require comment except stand there with the quality of a man who has made a decision and intends to be in the vicinity of it. "You came back," he said. "You asked me to," she said. "I did." He looked at her. "I would ask you something else." She waited. "There is a particular walk along the eastern boundary of the estate," he said, "that is good in the morning before the frost has lifted. Frances knows it. She has been asking since June whether the woman from the garden might visit the house, and I have not been able to tell her yes or no because I did not know your answer." Cecily looked at him. She thought about a child sitting beside a rose arbor crying without sound. She thought about a man who had called that child's grief a decision he had made that produced a household, because he was not a man who performed his self-knowledge and was not a man who defended himself from it. "Tell her yes," Cecily said. He did not smile exactly, yet something in the set of his face changed, the way ice changes when the temperature has shifted enough that the change is visible without being dramatic. And she thought she had perhaps misread his tiredness earlier, or not misread it, but read only part of it. The rest of it was something else, something that had been waiting a long time for a specific and accurate answer. "Then I would also like to ask," he said very quietly, "whether you would do me the honor of walking with me tomorrow morning, Miss Vane, at the eastern boundary, before the frost has lifted." "Yes," she said. "I believe I would." She held the reticule where the note was still folded, and she felt the slight weight of it against her wrist, and she thought, this is how it begins. Not with a declaration in a ballroom. Not with a moment made for an audience. With a walk in the morning, and a child who cried without sound, and a man who noticed the quality of attention a woman paid to a small distressed thing in a garden. He bowed. She curtsied. The music played behind them. Somewhere in the room, Lady Aldwych was speaking to Mrs. Hardcastle, and her voice had lost its carrying quality. And she sounded for the first time that evening like someone who was not performing anything for anyone, but simply talking to a woman she knew. Dorothea appeared at Cecily's elbow approximately 90 seconds later, with the expression of someone who has been waiting to appear for the past 10 minutes. "Well," said Dorothea. "Walk with me to the refreshment table," Cecily said, "and I will tell you what I can tell you in public." "Which is?" "Almost nothing," Cecily said, "but it is a great deal more than I knew at the beginning of the evening." They walked. "If you have been with me this far this evening, I am glad. Stay close, and you will see what a morning walk can hold." The following morning was the kind of morning that October sometimes produces in the English countryside, as though to remind everything that was about to die for winter that it had once been beautiful. The frost lay in the long grass of the eastern boundary like something woven there deliberately, and the sky was the pale, clear blue that does not last past 9 o'clock, and the light was gold and flat and gentle. Cecily walked in, her winter pelisse and her best half-boots, which were not quite adequate to the ground, and she did not mind. Frances walked between them, which was not precisely how the walk had been arranged, but which was how it had arrived, because Frances had been at the breakfast table when Cecily was shown in, and had looked at her with the expression of a child who is trying to determine whether a memory is accurate. Then she had said that she was the Beetle Woman, and Cecily had agreed that she believed she was. And that had been sufficient. Frances was 7 years old, and had her father's quality of stillness when she was thinking, and her mother's eyes, which Cecily did not know yet but would learn later from a small portrait in the library, kept turned to the wall for 4 years, and finally turned back that winter. She held her father's hand on the left side and Cecily's gloved hand on the right side, and she talked about the frost with a child's scientific exactness, noting where it had formed thickest and where it had retreated, and the Earl listened to her with the full attention of a man who has decided that the things his daughter finds worth saying are worth hearing. He said very little to Cecily, and she said very little to him, in the way of two people who have agreed on the direction they are going without yet having agreed on the pace or the path, and who are content to let the agreement stand without requiring it to be articulated every quarter-mile. Near the stone boundary wall, Frances let go of both their hands to investigate a section of wall where something had made a home in the moss, and they stood for a moment at a distance from her that was close enough to observe her and far enough to have a sentence or two. He said very quietly that she had not done that in some time. "Done what?" Cecily said. "Let go," he said. She watched Frances crouch beside the wall with the complete physical commitment of a child who has found something interesting, and she understood that he was not talking about the wall. "She is very like you," Cecily said, "in the way she observes things." He looked at her. "I am not certain that is a compliment," he said. And there was something in his voice that was almost barely, carefully, the edge of something that might one day become amusement. "It was," she said. "I meant it as one." He was quiet for a moment. The frost sparkled at the edge of the wall. Frances made a sound of discovery. "I owe you something more than a deed of purchase," he said. "You owe me nothing," she said. "The deed is already more than I expected from anyone. If you say you owe me something more, you will make it a transaction, and I am not interested in a transaction with you." He looked at her for a long moment with the expression she was beginning to recognize as the expression he wore when he was deciding whether to say the thing he meant or the thing that was safe to say. "Cecily," he said. He used her given name with the quiet deliberateness of a man who knows what he is doing and has chosen to do it anyway. She felt the name in her chest, where it settled without permission. "James?" she said. His face did not change in any way that could be described to someone who had not been watching it closely. She had been watching it closely, and it changed. "I am aware," he said, "that we have spoken, publicly, for approximately 15 hours across the span of 2 occasions, and that this is not sufficient time for a reasonable person to make a determination about anything consequential." "No," she agreed. "It is not." "I am also aware," he said, "that I have not been a reasonable person about anything since June." She looked at the frost on the grass and the pale sky and her breath visible in the cold air and the small figure of Frances, who had found something in the wall that was taking up her complete attention. "Neither," she said, "have I." He took her gloved hand. He did not do anything with it beyond hold it, and the holding was careful and deliberate and full of the particular heat of something that is being contained because it respects its own weight. Frances looked up from the wall. She looked at their joined hands. She made no comment on this, because she was 7 and had her father's quality of observing without necessarily requiring the observation to be shared. She went back to the wall. They stood for a long time in the October morning at the eastern boundary of Ashmore Park, and the frost began very slowly to lift, and the light changed, and neither of them said anything more for a while. And it was not silence in the way that silence sometimes is, which is the absence of something, but silence in the way it sometimes is instead, which is the presence of something that does not yet need words. The deed was registered in York by the end of the month. By Christmas, Cecily had visited Ashmore Park 4 times, each visit longer than the last, each one accompanied by the particular quality of ease that comes when two people have decided to trust what their own bodies have been telling them since they first stood near a piano in a candlelit ballroom and a room full of people had somehow contained only each other. By January, the question had been asked and answered in the library at Ashmore in the early morning, with a small fire laid against the cold, and Francis asleep upstairs, and the portrait of his late wife turned back to face the room. Because she had asked about it, and he had told her. And because he was not a man who needed to keep things turned to the wall any longer. He had said that he had loved her as best he could, and she was gone. And there was more love still in him that required somewhere to go. She had said she knew. He had said her name. She had said yes. That was all it needed. The fan stayed in Dorothea's drawing room cabinet. The note remained in the small locked drawer where Cecily put it the morning after the ball, because it was, she felt, the kind of thing a person keeps. Not as proof of anything. Not as evidence. Simply as the physical record of the moment when someone who had learned not to expect to be seen had been seen. And the seeing had arrived folded small, tucked between two ivory slats, in a borrowed garden. By the following October, when the autumn gathering at Ashmore Park was held again, and the 200 candles were lit again, and the mirrors along the west wall doubled them again, the woman in white muslin at the edge of the floor was Frances, who was 8 years old, and taking her first season's bow, and the woman standing beside her was not wearing white at all, but a deep green gown that needed no mending, and she held her own fan, ivory, unbroken, and she had no reason to stand at the edge of anything. She stood at the center, beside the man who had crossed a room for her, and the room decided what rooms always decide in the end, which is that the verdict they first delivered was wrong, and this was the right one, and it had been the right one for some time. Thank you for staying until the end.